Okay, we continue our discussion of personal identity with the views of Thomas Reid. Thomas Reid, here he is, was the father of Scottish common sense philosophy. And if you look at his dates, they're about the same as David Hume's. He's 1 year older and he lived 20 years longer. But they're both Scottish philosophers, and Reid read Hume's skeptical stuff and said, this guy's really smart, but it's all wrong, and I don't like his skepticism. And Reid said, we need to rely on common sense. Common sense is where it's at, and that should control all of our philosophical theorizing. Hume doesn't pay enough attention to common sense. That's where he goes wrong. And he applies that approach also to the issue of personal identity. All right. So here's an outline of Reid's view. We're going to talk about his understanding of the concept of identity, his understanding of the concept of personhood, and then our evidence for personal identity claims, and then Reid's argument for dualism. So first of all, let's talk about Reid's concept of identity. According to Reid, identity is a relationship between a thing which is known to exist at one time and a thing which is known to have existed at another time. And according to Reid, if two things are identical, well, they're one thing at that point. But if I'm identical with the person I was on Tuesday, then I've had a continued, uninterrupted existence. That is, there's no gaps in my existence. If I didn't like blip out of existence on Wednesday. So continued uninterrupted existence is a necessary condition of identity. So far, I think this is fairly uncontroversial, at least from Hume's point of view. Hume would just say nothing can meet this condition. So Thomas Reid wants to introduce two different concepts of identity. Here's the general concept, but we want to distinguish between perfect identity and what he's going to call imperfect identity. Let's talk about perfect identity first. The thing with perfect identity is that it's all or nothing. It doesn't come in degrees. So you're not mostly identical with yourself on Tuesday, or partially, or a little bit. You just are or you aren't. And for Reid, a perfect identity is incompatible with change. So if I changed, or if there's something different about me today than there was on Tuesday, I'm not identical. I don't have perfect identity with myself. I'm not the same person. And also that's a premise I think Hume would also accept. Reid says things with parts can't change. Why? Well, according to Reid, change involves either losing a part that you used to have or gaining a part that you didn't have before. But if you got something that has no parts, then it can't gain or lose any parts. It stays the same. Now you might think, what kind of things have no parts? That doesn't even make sense to me. Well, certainly Reid says, physical objects, they have parts. They always have parts, spatial parts, for example. You can always divide them further. So, and therefore physical things can always change. So he's not talking about a physical thing. He's going to say that persons have perfect identity, and therefore persons have no parts. For him, that's going to mean persons are not physical things at all, because all physical things are divisible. So he's going to say that the soul, the mind or the soul, is indivisible. It doesn't have parts. That's what a person is essentially, is a soul or a mind. If you want like an analogy for this idea of an indivisible thing with no parts, maybe you could think about a mathematical point. A line has parts. You can divide it into parts, but a mathematical point doesn't. And that's roughly probably the way he's thinking about what the person is. It's like that. Now contrast this idea of perfect identity. Oh, by the way, one more thing. Reid thinks that persons have perfect identity. That's what persons have. That's important. Now contrast that idea with imperfect identity. Now, imperfect identity, he says, it does come in degrees. You can be more or less the same as you were in terms of imperfect identity. He says it admits of great change in the subject, providing the change be gradual, sometimes even of a total change. So think about, plants or your dog, or you mean your own body. It changes over time. It switches out its cells. Sometimes it totally switches out its cells over a period of time. The acorn turns into an oak tree. There's been total changes here. And yet we still say, well, it's the same tree as the one I planted. I'm the same person as I was 7 years ago. It's the same dog I've always owned. We say stuff like that. And Reid says when we say that, we're employing the concept of imperfect identity. Really, what Reid's talking about with imperfect identity is what Hume was talking about with this fiction of identity. Hume also said, yeah, we talk like things have identity. It's a fiction. It's just kind of the way we use the language. We're wrong. Reid is saying, yeah, let's call that imperfect identity. It's not the perfect identity that we really care about when it comes to personhood, but it is a way that we use these terms. We throw it around all the time. Imperfect identity, he says, has no fixed nature. There's no right or wrong answer to whether an object has imperfect identity. It's however you want to use the words. That's fine. And Reid's going to claim that sensible bodies, physical bodies, they only have imperfect identity. Okay, so now we've got this concept of identity is on the table. The one that we're interested with personhood is perfect identity. That's not the kind that physical objects have. Let's move on now to the concept of a person. What is a person according to Reid? Well, there's two things he wants to say about a person. First of all, like I said before, a person is indivisible, not composed of parts. Now this is controversial. How does Reid get us there? Well, I think he's got a couple lines of argument. Here's one line of argument he has. Take this one that I put on here. Premise 1, I know that I am perfectly identical with myself over time. But premise 2, things with perfect identity are indivisible. Therefore, I am indivisible. That's a modus ponens, basically. Now, how does he know, though, that he is perfectly identical with himself over time? Well, Reid, at this point, is going to rely on common sense. We just know. Come on, people. Don't you all believe you're the same person today as you were 10 years ago? Yeah, you do. We all do. And that's what philosophy ought to accept as foundational, the deliverances of common sense. So if you believe that, and you also understand the concept of personhood, you also understand the concept of what perfect identity is, then you're going to realize that you're indivisible. You're not composed of parts. Now let me give you another line of argument he makes. He says, look, persons don't lose parts. For example, what would it be like to have half of a person? What would we even be talking about at that point? Would half a person be responsible for half the prison term for any crimes that the person committed? Would half of a person be would inherit half of the money that was coming to the person? Would half of a person be halfway married to a spouse or something like that? When you think about the concept of personhood, here's the example that he gives. Here's the quote that he's got. When a man loses his estate or his health, his strength, he's still the same person and has lost nothing of his personality. If he has a leg or an arm cut off, he's the same person he was before. The amputated member is not part of his person. Otherwise, it would have a right to part of his estate and be liable to a part of his engagements, he would be entitled to a share of his merit and demerit, and that's crazy. That's manifestly absurd. So clearly, your body is not your person, and you can't have person parts. All these crazy things would follow. What else is a person? Well, a person is something which thinks and feels and chooses. And here he's fighting against David Hume. Hume thinks that all we've got is thoughts and feelings and choices, but there's no thing which has all those. There's no subject of all those thoughts and feelings and choices. Reid says, yes, there is. There's the thing which does those things. He thinks that's just common sense. A person is not identical with their mental operations. A person is a distinct thing from those thoughts and emotions and sensations and so forth. Hume is just crazy when he thinks that we're a bundle of thoughts without a thinker having them. He says, no. Common sense says no. There is a subject of my thoughts. Well, here's Hume's objection, though. Hume says that's not a matter of common sense. On the contrary, that kind of self you're talking about, Thomas Reid, is inconceivable. And here's what I said before. All of our ideas are copied from impressions. We don't have an impression of a self, and therefore we have no idea of a self. Now, what's Reid's comeback here? Well, Reid denies premise one. He denies that all of our ideas are copied from impressions. We may not have a direct impression of a self, Reid might concede. That doesn't matter. Common sense says we have a self. I don't have to copy that idea from an impression. Now that's a whole different notion of how we form ideas. So it's an interesting debate. Where do we get our ideas from? How do I know? What kind of evidence do I have for the claim that I'm the same person as I existed on Tuesday, or I'm the same person that existed on Tuesday under my name? Well, Reid says your memory of your past actions and experiences provides evidence for your personal identity. So the fact that I can remember teaching class on Tuesday provides evidence that I am identical with the person who taught class on Tuesday. Also, there's other sources of evidence for personal identity. Maybe other people remember me teaching the class on Tuesday, even if I forgot about it. And that also proves I'm the same person that I was on Tuesday. Now, memory plays this important role in Reid's system. It gives us evidence of personal identity. But he's not taking the same position as Locke did. Locke said, your memory is what makes you the same person you were on Tuesday. Reid says, no. Even if I didn't remember what I did on Tuesday, I would still be the person who did it. Okay? Memory just gives me information about my personal identity. It doesn't constitute my personal identity. It's not my remembering of any action of mine that makes me to be the person who did it. That view is entirely mistaken. And in fact, Reid's got an awesome and memorable argument against Locke's view. The brave officer paradox. So imagine an officer in the army. When he was a boy, he was flogged by his teacher, beaten. When he grew to be a young man, he was in a battle and he had a brave moment and took the standard from the enemy. And when he grew old, he made general. Now, when the brave officer took the standard from the enemy, he could remember being flogged as a schoolboy. And when he became a general, he could remember taking the standard from the enemy. But by that point, he'd forgotten all about being flogged as a schoolboy. And that leads to a paradox for Locke's view. Look, because the officer at 20 could remember what happened to the officer when he was 10, then brave officer number 2 there is identical with brave officer number 1. And because the old general could remember what happened to the young man, he's identical with the young man. Officer 3 is identical with officer 2. But on Locke's view, because the general doesn't remember being flogged as a schoolboy, he is no longer the same person as the schoolboy. In other words, even though officer 1 equals officer 2 and officer 2 equals officer 3, officer 1 does not equal officer 3. But that's crazy. That's like a mathematical impossibility. So Locke's view must be false. When we come back, I want to say one more thing about Thomas Reid and his views, and then we'll be done.